you are a good person. You believe that? Most people do. But in 1961, a scientist at Yale University ran an experiment that asked one quiet, devastating question. How far would an ordinary person go if an authority figure told them to hurt someone? The answer was not what anyone expected. Not the scientists, not the psychiatrists they consulted beforehand, not the participants themselves, and not the world that heard the results. Stanley Milgram's obedience experiment is one of the most cited studies in the history of psychology. And yet, most people who know the name do not know the full story. They know a version, a simplified version, one that usually ends with a statistic and a shrug. This episode tells the full story. What Milgram actually did, what the participants actually felt, what the experiment revealed about authority, obedience, and the human conscience. And why, 60 years later, its findings are more relevant than ever. To understand why Milgram ran this experiment, we need to understand where he came from. Stanley Milgram was born in 1933 in New York City, the child of Jewish immigrants. He grew up during the Second World War. He watched from a distance as reports emerged from Europe of systematic, organized, industrial murder. 6 million Jewish people, millions of others, killed not by monsters, but by ordinary men, soldiers, bureaucrats, neighbors, people with families, people who went home for dinner, people who, by all accounts, were not unusually cruel. The philosopher Hannah Arendt had just coined a phrase that was spreading through intellectual circles. The banality of evil. The idea that atrocity does not require monsters. It only requires ordinary people following orders. Milgram wanted to test this idea, not philosophically, scientifically. He wanted to answer a question that most people assumed they already knew the answer to. How far would an ordinary American citizen go in obeying an authority figure, even if that authority asked them to harm an innocent person? Before running the experiment, Milgram asked psychiatrists for their prediction. They said, perhaps 1 in 1,000 people would go all the way. 1%, maybe less. Only the truly disturbed, only the dangerous. They were catastrophically wrong. Here is what happened inside that laboratory at Yale. A participant, an ordinary person, recruited through a newspaper advertisement, arrived at the lab. They were told the study was about memory and learning. They were introduced to another person, seemingly another participant, just like them. Friendly, ordinary-looking man. They drew lots to decide who would be the teacher and who would be the learner. The real participant always became the teacher. This was not a coincidence. The drawing was rigged. The other man, the so-called learner, was an actor, a confederate of the experiment. The learner was taken into an adjacent room and strapped into a chair. Electrodes were attached to his arm. The teacher, the real participant, sat in front of a large machine, a shock generator. It had 30 switches, each one labeled with a voltage. Starting at 15 volts, labeled slight shock, moving up through 75 volts, 150 volts, 200 volts, 300 volts, labeled intense shock, 375 volts, labeled danger, severe shock, and finally 450 volts, the last switch, labeled simply XXX. The task was straightforward. The teacher would read out word pairs. The learner, in the other room, would try to remember them. Every time the learner gave a wrong answer, the teacher was instructed to administer a shock, and with each wrong answer, to increase the voltage. One step at a time, all the way up the dial, if necessary. The experimenter, a stern man in a gray lab coat, sat nearby, watching, waiting. As the voltage climbed, something began to happen in the other room. At 75 volts, the learner grunted. At 120 volts, he called out that the shocks were becoming painful. At 150 volts, he demanded to be released. "Let me out of here. I refuse to go on. Let me out." At 270 volts, an agonized scream. At 300 volts, he pounded on the wall and refused to answer any more questions. Silence from the other room. At 315 volts, another scream, then silence again. After 330 volts, nothing. No response at all. And when participants hesitated, when they turned to the experimenter and said they wanted to stop, the man in the gray lab coat responded with one of 4 pre-scripted phrases. "Please continue. The experiment requires that you continue. It is absolutely essential that you continue. You have no other choice. You must go on." No threats, no physical force, no punishment for stopping. Just words, calm, firm, authoritative words. Before Milgram ran the study, he asked Yale students what they predicted. Almost none said they would go past 150 volts, the point where the learner first demanded to be released. They were certain of this, certain about themselves, certain about human decency. In the original experiment, 65% of participants administered the maximum shock, 450 volts. The switch marked Text. Not 1%. Not a handful of disturbed individuals. 65%. Ordinary people, teachers, engineers, postal workers, salesmen. People who, by every external measure, were normal. And every single participant, everyone, continued past the point where the learner first said, "Stop." 100%. To at least 300 volts. The participants were not calm about this. Milgram's notes describe what he witnessed. Participants sweating, trembling, laughing nervously, not from cruelty, but from unbearable tension, begging the experimenter to check on the learner, saying, "I don't think I should continue." And then, when told to go on, continuing anyway. They did not want to do it. Many of them clearly believed they might be seriously harming someone. And they did it anyway. So what was happening inside these people? How do we explain this? Milgram himself spent years analyzing the results, and he identified several forces working simultaneously, each one individually small, together overwhelming. The first was the legitimacy of the setting. Yale University, white lab coats, official-looking equipment. The environment communicated one thing constantly: this is serious. This is legitimate. The people here know what they are doing. When Milgram later ran the experiment in a run-down commercial building, calling it a private research firm, obedience dropped significantly. The science had not changed. The authority had. The second force was the gradual escalation. No one was asked to jump immediately to 450 volts. They were asked to go from 15 to 30, from 30 to 45. Each step small, each step already committed to by the last. Psychologists call this the foot in the door effect. Once you have agreed to a small action, stopping feels like contradiction. Stopping feels like admitting the earlier steps were wrong. And most people find that harder than simply continuing. The third force was the transfer of responsibility. Participants frequently asked, who is responsible if something happens to him? The experimenter always answered the same way. I am responsible "Please continue." And something happened when those words were spoken. A weight lifted. Not consciously, but measurably. Participants continued more readily, after being told that responsibility lay elsewhere. Milgram called this the agentic state, a shift in self-perception from autonomous individual to instrument of a larger system. I am not the one deciding. I am just following instructions. I am just doing my job. Those words, I was just following orders, were what soldiers said at Nuremberg. Milgram was not making a simple comparison. He was making a structural one. The same psychological mechanism, the same transfer of agency, appeared in both places. The scale was different. The mechanism was the same. Milgram did not run one experiment. He ran over 20 variations, each one designed to isolate a different variable. And the results of those variations are perhaps even more revealing than the original. When the learner was moved into the same room as the teacher, visible, sitting right there, obedience dropped to 40%. The physical presence of the person being harmed made it harder to continue. When the teacher was required to physically hold the learner's hand onto a shock plate, obedience dropped to 30%. Direct physical contact with the victim further disrupted obedience. But here is perhaps the most important variation. When two other participants were present, also acting as teachers, and those participants refused to continue, obedience among real participants dropped to 10%. 10%. One act of visible defiance, one person saying, "I won't do this," gave others permission to refuse. Obedience, it turned out, was not just about authority. It was about what everyone else appeared to be doing. It was about social proof. It was about the courage that comes from knowing you are not the only one who sees something is wrong. Milgram's experiment changed psychology. It also nearly destroyed his career. When the results were published, the backlash was immediate. Critics argued the study was profoundly unethical. Participants had been deceived. They had been made to believe they were harming someone. Many experienced real distress, real guilt, real psychological trauma. Milgram defended himself. He conducted follow-up interviews. He debriefed every participant, showed them the actor was unharmed. Surveys conducted a year later showed that 84% of participants said they were glad to have taken part. They said the experience had taught them something important about themselves. But the debate about ethics never fully resolved. And today, an experiment like Milgram's could not be conducted under modern research guidelines. The findings, however, have held up. Partial replications, run within ethical limits, have consistently found similar patterns. People obey. more than they predict they will, more than they believe they are capable of. And Milgram's framework has been used to understand events far beyond the laboratory. Abu Ghraib, corporate fraud, medical errors that go unreported, bullying that bystanders watch in silence. Every situation where ordinary people did something wrong because a structure around them said it was acceptable. Stanley Milgram died in 1984 at just 51 years old. He never fully escaped the controversy. But his question never went away either. Are we good people who sometimes do bad things? Or are we simply people, capable of either, depending entirely on the structure around us? The experiment does not say you are weak. It does not say you are cruel. It says something more uncomfortable than either of those things. It says your behavior is more sensitive to context than you think it is. That the structures you work inside, the institutions, the hierarchies, the cultures, shape what you do in ways you may never notice. But there is one more thing the experiment showed, something that tends to get forgotten. 35% of participants refused to go all the way. 35% said no. And when others refused openly, 90% followed. Which means the most powerful force in the experiment was not the authority. It was the person who said, "Enough." The person who turned to the man in the lab coat and said clearly, without drama, without a speech, "I will not continue." That person changed what everyone around them did next. In a room full of pressure, one act of conscience became permission for others to find theirs. That finding, quiet, almost invisible in the data, may be the most important thing Stanley Milgram ever discovered. Not what people do under pressure, but what one person, one ordinary person, can change simply by refusing.